Hi, I'm Teresa from Phoenix Gate Crafts, and I'm here to tell you about all the things you need for soap making, as well as some that you don't. So, quick caveat, we're talking about melt and pour soap. I don't know about cold process or hot process. Those are different and require some different equipment. But with melt and pour soap, you do actually need a knife, all joking aside. You want the knife to be long, you want it to have a smooth blade so you're not putting any weird textures into your soap. You want it to be a little bit wider in, the blade itself, so that way it's easier to stabilize as you press. You're going to use it for two different reasons. The first one being that you're going to cut up your soap base and you're going to also cut up any finished loaves that you make into bars. So having a blade on hand is very handy. And by the way, going to say this now so I don't forget later, all items that you use for soap making should be dedicated to soap making. You should not make food afterwards. The soap base itself isn't so much the concern, aside from the fact that you might wind up having some soap residue on, the items if you're not rinsing them well enough. But there are caustic items in soap that really shouldn't be ingested, such as the colorants and the fragrance oils. And a lot of the natural stuff, the biodegradable glitter, you wouldn't want to eat that. Your body can't necessarily process it. So just whatever items you're using, soap only. Anyway, in addition to a knife, you're going to need something to cut on. I mean, you could use the counter. It just becomes a problem to get anything that presses into the counter off. It's not hard, it's just like one extra step. So I recommend a cutting board. And if you're going to be using a cutting board like this, because this thing will slide when you put pressure on it, I also recommend a non-slip mat. You can get these at like Bed Bath & Beyond or Target. I think my husband actually got this one from Home Depot. So yeah, you can get them in a lot of places. The thing that is actually the most important thing, but technically isn't a tool, is your soap base. I know, this isn't actually soap base. I am out at the moment. This is the closest I got as a stand-in representation. But what you do is you get the base you want. So if you want shea butter in your soap, get a shea butter base. If you want aloe in your soap, get an aloe vera base. If you want honey in your soap, get a honey base. You want low sweat, get a low sweat base. Honestly, it is the easiest thing just to get the base you want. Most of them cost around the same amount of money. I found most of them are between $4.50 and $5 a pound. But this is the big consumable good. And you can't melt and pour soap without the melt and pour soap. So get melt and pour soap or cosmetic bases that you can whip up. Question for the audience. Do you think I should make this into soap? Maybe without whipping? We'll experiment later. The next thing you're going to need are containers. So I suggest going to the dollar store and getting cheapo containers. That way, if you accidentally melt it, or if you leave it with the fragrance oil too long, or you stain it or anything, this way you don't feel bad about chucking it and buying a new one. This one came from the dollar store. It did have a partner, but I melted that one by mistake. But I don't feel bad because it only cost me $1 and I did use it twice, so that's not too bad. These were a little bit more expensive. They're about $5 each, and they're also 4 cups. And these are really handy, especially if you're pouring into teeny tiny embed molds, because you can get a pretty precise pour without having any weird trying to get into your, nothing's gonna knock into it. So I highly recommend these if you can spring for them, but if not, dollar store. The pitchers are very useful because as you cut up your soap base, you're going to have something in which to melt it. You're also going to need to be able to pour it out pretty easily, hence the pitchers. You're also going to need spoons. Now, you can use a real metal spoon. However, I wouldn't want to accidentally wind up eating from that spoon, so I went ahead and got a whole bunch of plastic ones. If you don't like plastic spoons, you can use spatulas, you can use popsicle sticks, toothpicks, anything that you prefer to use for stirring. I know Dean Wilson on YouTube uses kebab skewers. So, anything useful that you can stir with or scrape with is going to do the job you need it to do, because as you melt your melt and pour, you're going to need to stir it so that it melts evenly and you don't accidentally burn anything. So, spoons. You're also going to need something to color it. So I use Mica colorants, but you can also use made for soap liquid colorants. Either one's fine. They're equally replaceable with each other. You can use either one, you can use both of them, it doesn't really matter. You're also going to need something nice and smelly. So, oops, I have a little bit that spilled, my mistake. So this is fragrance oil. You can also use essential oils, but something to scent your soap is usually something that we like to add. Very rarely do people get melt and pour bases so that they can just melt them, pour them, and that's it. Usually we want to do something kind of pretty with them. So be it colorants, fragrances, essential oils, anything like that. That's our primary artistic medium between the soap bases, colors, and fragrances. You're going to need rubbing alcohol. Now, you can get 70% isopropyl alcohol. That is going to be 30% water though, and the water can leave little droplet residue on your soap, which you may or may not be going for. Usually we don't go for that. So I recommend getting 91% or 99% just because the water content is lower and it'll evaporate a little faster because of it. Also, having it in a convenient spray bottle makes it so that as you melt and pour your bases, you can break surface tension and you can pop bubbles before they get set into your soap. It also tends to glue any layers of soap together. And whenever you're adding soap embeds or anything into your soap, you want to give it a good coating of alcohol. Otherwise, it can pop out after you cut it. So just to be on the safe side, alcohol in a spray bottle. It's not the fun kind of booze, but we use it for fun reasons. And the last thing you're going to need are some soap molds. Now this is your basic 6 soap bar molds, but you can get decorative molds. You can get a loaf mold, which is a big, but I should just show it to you. Fine loaf molds. This one came in a solid wood thing with a mold inside, and you can pour about 3 pounds or so of melt and pour bases in here. You can do a bunch of different decorations, and then you use your handy dandy knife to cut the bars once you pull it out of the mold. So this is actually everything that you need. You need the stuff to make the melt and pour, you need the stuff to deal with the melt and pour, and you need the stuff to pour it into. You'll also want some basic safety equipment. The one you absolutely cannot go without are gloves. I get nitrile exam gloves that are powder free and safe for food handling. I find these at Walgreens, but you know, any of them that you prefer work just fine, because some of the things you're handling are not food safe. You don't necessarily want to accidentally ingest them. And also the fragrance oils can actually be quite caustic when they're at full concentration. So being safe is better for you in the long run, especially if you do this more than once in your lifetime. Also, face masks. Now, face masks are a bit of a debated topic when it comes to melt and pour, because you don't need it for the melt and pour soap making process itself. This is just a basic protection if you're using micas, which can cause a breathing hazard if you inhale them. However, most of the time, if you're only being a hobbyist, you're making like 1 bar of soap in an evening and you're not doing it every single day, you're probably not at a very high risk of inhalation, but you know, sometimes the fan will kick a little bit up into the air and you'll breathe it in. You might have a bit of an accident. You might sneeze in a very Disney-like way and it'll puff up and you'll inhale it. Most of the powders are very fine, so your lungs will be able to expel them back out most of the time. But, you know, if you have repeated exposures, if you have lung issues already, you can eventually develop fibroids that can cause serious lung problems. So having a mask, even if it's just a basic one like this, works pretty well most of the time. If you're doing this professionally or on a very regular basis, it is worth the investment in an N95 mask. And now for the stuff you don't have to have, though it is very handy sometimes. The big one that some people are going to insist I'm putting in the wrong category is a scale. Now, you're not going to see me recommending volume measuring. I gave you the 4-cup pitchers just because I want you to know the approximate size. That is very useful because those fit in your microwave. They can fit in a double boiler. I wouldn't recommend that plastic for double boiler. And the shape of them is very useful. But you're not going to use them for volume measurements. You're just going to use them to melt your soap base. The way you're going to measure everything and make sure your proportions are in sync is actually from a digital scale. Now, this is a food scale. This happens to be a Weight Watchers one, but any scale that does ounces and grams will be sufficient. Ideally, you want it to be able to do grams to a decimal point and ounces to 2 decimal points. But if you don't have that, you know, whatever does work, you're going to get as close as you can. Because with melt and pour, it being a pre-made soap base, you're only adding up to 5% of your soap by weight in additives. So that includes your colorant, that includes your fragrance oil, that includes botanicals or extra oils or anything else that you're putting in. The way you figure out how much you can put in is by weight and perhaps a little bit of math. So having a scale is extremely useful. However, if you're just dealing with a little bit of colorant and a couple of bases and that's it, you don't even necessarily need this because you can eyeball the colorant and you're probably not going to go over your maximum amount. I also highly recommend a thermometer gun. I have not opened this yet, but I am very excited to do so. And this one came with an actual digital read thermometer that you can stick in. This one is not meant for measuring a person's temperature. And I don't know if you're technically able to use this one in meat or as a candy thermometer. I have to read the instructions on the bottom. But this is the one you want because being able to just point and click at your soap and find out what the temperature is on the surface is extremely handy, especially if you're doing anything complex like layers or swirls. Melt and pour is very temperature dependent in many cases, and you don't want to be pouring too hot or too cold. You want to have enough time to actually do what you want to do, and having a thermometer with an instant read can make a difference. You may also want some additional cutting implements. There are soap cutters. There are wavy soap cutters. There are wavy soap knives. Apparently I scare my husband with this. I've decided to nickname it Johnny Corkscrew because of the sword in Peter Pan. There are cheap crap soap cutters. This isn't going to work well. I recommend something with a metal, slightly sharper edge. And if you want to bevel your edges, I recommend a potato peeler. These are actually very handy. This one happens to be Cutco because my husband used to sell Cutco and we had an extra. But you can also bevel edges with a knife. So not strictly necessary, but definitely gives your soaps a professional clean edge at the end. You also will probably want teeny tiny little cups. This is plastic. I know there are some more biodegradable options out there like corn cups, but you'll want some single-use cups for mixing your colorant. If you're dealing with mica, all you have to do is spray a little bit of alcohol in here so that you can mix up a little bit of your mica powder. One, to get the powder under control, but also to make it easier to pour in and mix into your base. If you don't want to use plastic, you can always use glass. This is actually what I recommend if you're measuring out fragrance oil. You tear this jar out without a lid on your scale, and then you use a pipette, another recommended item, to put your fragrance oil into the glass jar. Then you have a second glass jar that you can put your empty pipette into, so that way you're not getting fragrance oil all over the damn place. I recommend glass for fragrance oils because many fragrance oils are very caustic and they will eat plastic. My first attempt, I left one of these sitting with a fragrance oil in it, and it wound up eating the bottom of the cup, and I got fragrance oil all over my scale. That's why I got the Weight Watchers one. So you'd rather be safe than sorry. I recommend using glass for fragrance oil. The reason these aren't strictly necessary is because you can pour directly into your soap base. It's not particularly accurate if you do, but you can do it. You're also going to need something to deal with your soap after you've made it. Now, if you're making just a couple of bars and you're giving them away within a couple days to be used immediately, you really don't need to wrap them or anything. However, glycerin is a humectant, and it is the main ingredient in melt and pour soap bases. And because it's a humectant, it does have a tendency to gather water and moisture from the air, creating glycerin sweat, which is a gooey, icky substance that, although there's nothing really wrong with it, a lot of people don't like. So if you're not using your soap immediately, it is a good idea to wrap it. And there's two ways to do it. One way is to use shrink wrap. Yes, you are going to need a heat gun for this, but it's the most professional looking option, especially if you're planning to sell your soaps. An alternative idea is to use cling wrap or saran wrap or clingy plastic or plastic wrap, whatever you want to call it from whatever region you're from. You can also use a heat gun to seal that up so it has a more professional look, but the shrink wrap is a little bit thicker and it will keep more moisture out more likely. It's less prone to holes. Speaking of, I recommend a heat gun. Not only is it really good for wrapping your soaps afterwards to protect them from the air and the moisture, it's also very handy if you're doing soap embeds on top of soap, or if you're going to be doing soap frosting or anything like that. You can use your heat gun to melt a little bit of the top layer of your soap once it's hardened, so you have a little bit of something liquid that will actually be able to cling onto or adhere to your embeds or your frosting or whatever you're adding. It's just a little bit of something extra that really helps and might minimize the amount of alcohol you'll have to spray, though you'll still probably need to use a little bit, at least if you're doing soap embeds. And while we're talking about power tools, I know, my husband says that I get gadgets in my hand and I turn into Tim the Toolman Taylor. Ho, ho, ho. But this is very handy if you want to do anything with a little bit of texture. If you're doing any kind of soap frosting or anything, you will need some kind of fast mixing device. Now, if you're just adding color and fragrance, you do not need this at all. But if you want to do soap frosting, you are going to have to whip it up. And having this dedicated to soap making is going to be better for anybody actually eating real frosting in the future. Fragrance oil doesn't taste as good as it smells, I promise. In terms of other random crap, I also recommend having a ruler, so that way you can cut your bars evenly by measuring. Also, having a strainer of some kind. You don't need to sift too many ingredients usually, but if you want to have a layer of glitter or something on or between your layers of melt and pour, this is a quick and easy way to do it, because you can just put your little bit in and then tap it across, and you wind up with a much more even distribution than if you just used your hands. I also recommend a paintbrush, because here's a really cool thing that you can do, and it's a super easy effect, but it's a super amazing effect at the same time. You use a paintbrush and you dip it into your mica, dry. Make sure your brush is dry. You dip it into your mica and then you just brush it inside of any shaped mold. And you're going to have a mica layer. So you can really get detailed and control if you want to do it just in crevices. So like if you have roses, you could wind up with a really pretty rose design. And you can have like a dusting of pink mica on top of your red rose soap, and that would be super pretty. I have used this in my gold mica, so that way I wound up with just a brushed gold appearance on the outside of some of my bars. Very easy and effective, and you're not going to want to paint with this afterwards, but it's definitely going to be handy for this. And the cool thing is it's a pretty easy wash off after you're finished, so you can just use it again for a different color. And last but not least, you're going to want anything that you want to actually put on top. So there are very restricted botanicals that you can actually put in melt and pour soap. I know that marigold or calendula dried petals is one that is okay. I know that poppy seeds are okay. I know that completely dry used coffee grounds are also okay. And there's a handful of other things. I will link a list in the description box if you'd like to check that out. But there are very few things that you can successfully put in melt and pour that are not going to mold or rot within a couple of months. So be careful putting those in. They are all optional. You do not need them at all. But, you know, they can be quite pretty. Just be careful. And last but not least, more molds! Okay, that was a bit forced. Sorry about that. But having additional molds for embeds or pretty designs is not necessary. You can get soap literally by just melting and pouring your base. But sometimes having a clear base with a really pretty flower inside absolutely makes your soap go from plain and boring to something special and unique. And doing different color effects and unique scents really can turn a very basic household commodity into a luxury item. So whatever you do, you know, this is by no means an extensive list. This is just some ideas and a whole bunch of stuff that I've invested in. So if you need just the basic set, get the safety equipment, get the things I mentioned for cutting, mixing, boiling. You know what, I'm going to go ahead and change it. I am recommending that the scale be a required item. You really can't measure it successfully any other way. You could easily wind up putting too much of something in if you do it by volume, because you know, you might be dealing with 3 different colors of mica and they could all have a different density and they don't all need the same amount to be saturated. So, you know, get the scale, have a basic knife, have a cutting board, have your soap base, have your colorant, and have your fragrance and a scale. Have a mask and have some gloves. That's all you need. It is not a high investment to get into melt and pour if it's something you want to do. It is fairly kid friendly. If you want kids to do it, don't let them handle the knife. Don't let them handle the fragrance oil or the mica. But if you have drip colorants, you know, liquid colorants for soap, they can handle those with supervision. And hopefully they're mature enough. But it's family friendly and honestly quite a lot of fun. And I wish you the best of luck. Happy crafting. Bye.